Hello, I'm Dr. David Johnson, Professor of Medicine and Chief of Gastroenterology at Eastern Virginia Medical School in Norfolk, Virginia. Well, colonoscopy has taught us a lot about slower is better, increasing adenoma detection rate, correlating thereby with decreased colorectal cancer interval cancer risk, and improved colorectal mortality data, and all those lines of evidence are quite clear. But what about what we do with endoscopy and Barrett's esophagus? Those lines aren't quite so clear. In a very provocative, I think very informative study that was just published from the United Kingdom in endoscopy really tells us that slower and longer is better. Let's get into it and talk about first the background. Well, the background for endoscopic surveillance is recommended by the most recent guidelines proffered by Dr. Nick Shaheen and a colleague from the American College of Gastroenterology. Emphasize that the Seattle protocol should be used. This is a protocol that most of you may not be old enough to remember that in 1993 when this came out, it was to carefully inspect the Barrett's segment with biopsies of any, first of all, endoscopic visible lesions, and then followed by 4-quadrant standard biopsies at most every 2 centimeters and less for high-risk patients, perhaps with dysplasia. And this was to then dictate how they should be best surveyed based on the early detection of dysplasia. We know, however, that this type of protocol is unfortunately not quite used as it should be. The community-based assessment from the United States suggests that it actually meets the criteria for Seattle recommendations only a little more than 50% of the time. As far as this, it also decreased with the increasing length of segment of the Barrett's esophagus. So patients were not getting surveyed by the standard protocol that we would say is the baseline for what we should view as endoscopy and screening in Barrett's. More on a worldwide basis, an analysis and meta-analysis, systematic review of 45 studies, found that the endoscopic adherence to the Seattle protocol is marginally even less than that, 49%. So as a generality, we don't do what we should be doing as it relates to the Seattle protocol. Well, how do we even justify that we're doing something? And in fact, the surveillance data on this really has not been consistent as it relates to decreasing the relative risk for cancer and cancer-related death. So the data, at least as it relates to retrospective studies, really has shown some marginal improvement, but in case control studies, those have not been evident. So taken as a whole, these studies suggest that a mortality benefit for surveillance of what we do in the Barrett's esophagus screening say that supporting endoscopic surveillance the evidence is very low, and the quality of the evidence supporting this is very low, and it's likely lead and or length time bias that further attenuate the reported survival benefits. So supporting what we do and based it on survival really is not that easy. Well, what did we learn from the colon? Well, it's all about quality, and the same as it adheres to what we should be doing in Barrett's esophagus. When we look at the data from the study from the United Kingdom, it's a retrospective analysis, but a double-blind crossover study evaluating high-definition white light endoscopy with Seattle protocol biopsies, 4-quadrant biopsies, versus the autofluorescence and confocal laser endomicroscopy with targeted biopsies. And what they demonstrated, they looked at 142 patients, but the average time, and they broke it into different lengths of Barrett's esophagus that went from less than 5 centimeters to greater than 11 centimeters. And basically they showed that the median length of time to provide this standard endoscopy was approximately 16 plus minutes. So again, when we look at endoscopy schedules, I've seen several schedules where endoscopy is perhaps targeted for a 15-minute slot. And this includes not only the exam, the sedation, the biopsies, the post-procedural checks and reporting time, and all those things that are now implicit with what we do in quality endoscopy. But the time slots are very short. And when we get into Barrett screening, it really is implicit that this should be a lot longer. When we look at this particular study, the odds ratio is increased by 1.1 times relative to the allocation of appropriate time. For each 1 centimeter of Barrett's esophagus, the incremental time was approximately 0.9 minutes, so a little bit longer, but incremental yield as it relates to detection of both low and high-grade dysplasia and actually intramucosal carcinoma. And again, these were without visible lesions. So we find that driving the time element and going more slowly drives the quality, and it relates to a better outcome. The data that these authors suggest that for a Barrett's esophagus up to 5 centimeters, using this time allocation, a 30-minute slot should be really altered and allocated. And for Barrett's that are greater than that, then you should actually double slot these patients, and it'd take approximately 40 minutes. So what does this mean? Well, we clearly can do better. What was not allowed in this particular study was also the use of narrowband imaging, and this should be the standard, and the American College guidelines support strongly that the standard should be the use of electron microscopy, chromoendoscopy, or acetic acid, and these are things that routinely are best available, perhaps using the chromoendoscopy through narrowband imaging. Recognize that Dr. Pratik Sharma and his colleagues put together really a brilliant categorization called the Bing criteria, which stands for Barrett's International NBI Group, Narrowband Imaging, the N. And these were to develop and validate a prospective consensus-driven classification, which really has emerged as should be the standard. This is a consensus that uses criteria, morphologic characteristics, both on mucosal pattern and vascular pattern, and the regularity or irregularity of these dictate what the classification of the Bing criteria should be, and again, helps us allocate how these patients should be surveyed. Recognize that what we see and what we get on histologic drives what we then do as far as consensus for intervals. So then American College Guidelines is advocating that we can lengthen these intervals out for smaller lengths of Barrett's, and certainly tighten them up for longer and more evidence of risk. But taking into account, we obviously can do better. We learned a lot from colonoscopy and colon polyps. Are we just starting to learn this on the esophagus? I think clearly this is a characteristic that should be quality driven. The outcomes, I think, are intuitive, and certainly studies will likely bear this out. But to me, this is actionable now. It just take more time. Make sure you budget appropriately, but go more slowly. Barrett's esophagus, we clearly, I think, need to be able to change the outcomes. We're on the tipping point of showing that, but we need to adhere more time, go more slowly, pay attention, use the narrowband imaging, the Bing criteria, or some type of chromoendoscopy as implicit for this. And please, the Seattle protocol was not meant to be occasionally used. It should be standard. Dr. David Johnson, let's do this and improve outcomes in Barrett's. We can do it. Thanks for listening.